A year on from the Southport massacre and subsequent nationwide riots, Keir Starmer's government are desperate. They don't know what to do because Britain is on the brink of burning as civil unrest threatens to break out after another spate of nationwide protests against illegal migration beginning in Epping and cascading across the country. That, plus, is crime really going down in London? We'll address Fraser Nelson's claim that you should disbelieve your own lying eyes, and has Kemi Badenoch's time come, when even your own MPs and friendly outlets like The Spectator are briefing against you and checking their watch for when Robert Jenrick or, God forbid, James Cleverly can take over? I think it's fair to say that Kemi's days are numbered. All that and more this week on Tomlinson Talks. Britain is on the brink of breaking out into civil unrest, its streets ablaze and filled with angry protesters, and the state has no idea what to do. Leaking his cabinet briefing to The Times and the Daily Mail, Keir Starmer is sending up the flare to the public to say, if you cause any trouble, I will crack down on you with the full force of the law. And by the public, he means, as Dominic Cummings put in a recent Substack, the far right brackets code for white people. What they think is conflict only arises and integration doesn't happen when the native host population who do not want mass migration and multiculturalism notice the economic, cultural, and criminal problems of immigration on social media rather than immigration itself causing these problems. So you noticing the problem is itself the problem to the state. And so the only way they know to prevent social and civil unrest is further censorship and imprisoning people like Peter Lynch and Lucy Connolly. If they think that's going to stop it, they're deluded, but it doesn't look like, as David Betts has warned, there's much of a political off-ramp here. So here's the briefing that Keir Starmer gave to his cabinet with Angela Rayner and Liz Lloyd. He says, Britain is fraying at the edges. It is vital to repair Britain's social fabric and improve integration in areas that have experienced high levels of migration. How? Integration hasn't happened. It's impossible to integrate millions of migrants who have an apathetic or hostile attitude towards British culture and do not live around the native British host population and are people that the British host population didn't want here in the first place. Like, you can't do it. How are you going to integrate the cousin-marrying enclaves from Mirpur, Pakistan, from which the racist Islamic Pakistani grooming gangs spawned, and which covered up for them, because they didn't want to be seen as siding with the white enemy, according to the head of the Ramadan Foundation in 2016. You can't do it. And so you've just got these antagonistic tribes existing in the same country who are not content to share the country, because one inherited the country from their ancestors and feel dispossessed of it, and the other, as is embodied by the likes of Bob Villan and the cheering crowd at Glastonbury, of all colours, think, well, if you want your country back, nuh-uh, we've stolen it, you're a gammon, and we're going to run you out of town. Shut the F up. So, those are the two tribes. Impossible for the state to reconcile this. Liz Lloyd recognises this. She says that actually the best way to improve Keir Starmer's falling popularity is a crackdown in law and order. So Lloyd said to a presentation to ministers at Chequers that social cohesion is fraying at the edges as services are unable to keep up with changes in time and migration. They genuinely think the state exists to make all of these disparate groups play nice, and so it is actually sufficiently funded public services that stop people from being angry at each other, not intractable, deeply entrenched cultural prejudices which are irreconcilable. She suggests a more forceful policy on law and order would be needed to restore waning trust in the government, as well as public service reform and a more active approach to the economy. Translation: higher taxes and throwing more white English people that complain about the problem in prison. Now, where do those taxes go? Well, it turns out lots of it is spent, as of 2024, 14.4 billion a year, on illegal migrants. And that includes housing the men that come over via the English Channel in hotels at taxpayers' expense. And these illegal migrants include one Ethiopian asylum seeker who, within days of arriving, allegedly sexually assaulted a 14-year-old girl in Epping. He lives at the Bell Hotel, or at least soon to be lived, And this kick-started 2 weeks now of protest by Essex locals, mums and dads, concerned families, against the government's plan to battery farm foreign sex offenders at their expense within the vicinity of a school. And this isn't the first time this has happened as well. This happened in Manchester in 2024. There were locals who noted that there was a migrant hotel right behind 2 schools in Altrincham, and this was the Cresta Court Hotel, they objected in a town hall meeting, and they were told by a community police officer, his name was Colin Dieter, that a curfew couldn't be imposed upon the men because, quote, "We can't lock up people who haven't committed a crime. We live in a very tolerant and open society, and we have to continue that." And so, in there is a liberal religious statement, a commitment to universal human rights, which treats every single person, including sex offenders from the third world, as indistinguishable and interchangeable with British children and concerned parents. But also, he has committed a crime. He's broken into the country. Every illegal migrant is illegal. But these people have genuinely imbibed the belief that no human is illegal, and therefore, if they've broken into the country, it is actually our fault for not giving them a safe and legal route into the country, because the logical endpoint of their ideology is the entire third world ends up here. And it is just a matter of laws that need to be changed and logistics that need to be ironed out in order to facilitate that, rather than the native host majority going, well, I didn't really want all of these Ethiopian sex offenders lurking around a girls' school, so can we not have that? Thank you. I mean, this also happened with a school in Deanshanger in January of this year. Parents were calling up the asylum hotel, and people were recorded, poor receptionist behind the desk, recorded saying, yeah, we've been getting a lot of reports for this, the police haven't done much. The police at once said that there was no evidence of this happening, but also they were going to talk to the men about their, quote, cultural expectations. So denying it was happening, while also saying, well, we know it's happening, so we'll give them a stern lecture on women's rights to sort it out. Turns out that the British public don't think stern lectures on women's rights are going to fix this, because this Epping protest has been massive, consistent, largely peaceful, and has spread nationwide to places like Ashford and Canary Wharf, where people have also found that sex offenders are being housed in hotels at public expense. The sex offender in question, or alleged sex offender, is Hadush Gerabalaze Kabatu from Ethiopia. Well, he was last in France, so he should have stayed there. But also, he shouldn't be here in the first place. He should be deported, whether or not he's committed these offences. Why are we pretending that every single last one of these men is some poor, benighted refugee, when, as we know from the story I helped GB News break in 2023, they pay people smugglers who advertise our women and girls as ripe for the taking by any enterprising man from the Middle East, North or Sub-Saharan Africa who happens to have a penchant for white women. We know this is what they think before they come here, so why are we shocked when this happens disproportionately from men from this region of the world who are willing to break every law and cross every border to come here to access the dwindling largesse of the British taxpayer and our wives, sisters, daughters, friends, even mothers? So this continued. And the reason the government are worried is because the police are wholly unprepared. Not only have lots of armed response officers and even riot police walked off the job since the fatal shooting of Chris Carbar, totally justified, by the way, because, I mean, he's alleged to have shot someone on a club dance floor, and he was a wanted suspect for this. So the armed officers in question were, one, worried about being driven at and killed by a Carbar's car, but also worried about being shot, as is a risk with drill rap gangs in Brixton. But in the Telegraph, one of the heads of the Police Federation, Tiff Lynch, has actually written that the police are being pulled in every direction and that they are incapable of actually quelling widespread civil unrest should it break out in the summer. So the state knows that they don't have the enforcement capacity to keep the British public in check if they no longer see the state as legitimate and therefore no longer go along with the enforcement of the laws. The reason the state enforces a narco-tyranny is because they recognise there are two populations. There is a law-abiding population, usually the native host indigenous population, who will vote for the expansion of the security apparatus to crack down on the crime that the state itself has created and tolerated to expand its own powers. But also there's a clientele class of criminals, which the Labour Party has been releasing early, in order to actually make space for more mums and granddads like Lucy Conley and Peter Lynch, who have sent tweets that they don't like, while letting out, drug salesmen and people guilty of manslaughter. So they recognise this criminal underclass exists. They recognise that they are a client group that are more likely to vote for them. And they recognise that they can weaponise them against the native population, like the Soviet gulags did with the murderers, thieves, and sex offenders imprisoned under the Tsarist regime against anti-communist dissidents. The state is doing the exact same thing here. And they do this because they recognise that the people they're victimising, the host majority, are more likely to go along with the laws because they see it as their country, their government, their culture, their laws. Whereas criminal immigrant groups without a conscience don't. They just act on impulse for their own gratification and have no loyalty to the state beyond the payments it can give and the permission it can provide them to commit crimes. But if the host majority no longer see the police as being on their side, no longer see the state as legitimate, no longer see the laws as something to abide by, well, the police can't hold that back. And again, I want to reiterate, don't cause any violence. Don't give the state that is looking for an excuse to lock you up a reason to. However, this is a prediction, not encouragement, a prediction, that if civil unrest were to become widespread, as the police themselves are telling us, the government and the armed forces and the police will be unable to control it. So they are petrified of this. So, why then did Essex Police escort stand up to racism protesters to the front line of the peaceful protest with parents? Why are they bringing communist agitators, and they are communist agitators, because they're members of the Socialist Workers Party, why are they bringing them as a kind of communist conga line, leading them like they're on a school trip, to stand right beside the parents? And if you pause there, if you can see here, there's a couple of people dressed very suspiciously. They aren't holding signs. They have sunglasses. They have masks. Why are the police escorting disguised, masked protesters with nothing distinguishing them from the parents protesting, because they're not holding any signs like all of their compadres or comrades are? Why are the police escorting these people right to stand next to the parents? Is it to cause conflict, either from within the parents' protest using agent provocateurs, or just cause tensions to escalate sufficiently between the two groups as a pretext to shut the parents' protest down, call them all far-right, and delegitimize their concerns about illegal migration? David Shipley helped break the story. He's doing excellent work over at The Spectator and Telegraph. Recommend looking at his investigative journalism. When Essex Police were presented with this video, beforehand they had equivocated and said, well, we didn't drive them there. We didn't bust them in. They did drive them home, though, by the way. They packed them in police vans and drove them home, so they gave them a lift back. But they tried to pretend that they had no role in bringing them to the protest site because they used the phrase, we didn't bust them in. When they were presented with video evidence by David Shipley, it was very telling. Assistant Chief Constable Stuart Hooper said, we have a reasonable duty to protect people who want to exercise their rights. In terms of bringing people to the hotel, the police have a duty to facilitate free assembly. We would only ever take people away from protest if we felt there was an immediate threat to people or property, to free up police resources, to protect others, or to prevent additional violence. In Epping, officers took all three of those into account before making their decision. So number one, in this justification, is the accusation that the people of Epping are violent, and that it would have otherwise been a perfectly reasonable and peaceful protest to escort all of these communist agitators from outside of Epping to this protest, if only the Epping locals didn't kick off and start attacking them. So it's an insult to the people of Epping. But also, suddenly, Essex Police have discovered a commitment to free speech, which they didn't have when they were threatening Allison Pearson with arrest using a counter-terror unit for a deleted tweet about pro-Hamas and pro-Palestine marches. So excuse me if I don't think one of the most woke, censorious police forces in the country, who are addicted to non-crime hate incidents and Malicious Communications Act charges and public order offences, have suddenly down the back of the sofa discovered a copy of the European Convention on Human Rights and are extending this universally rather than to just their preferred client group, who look suspiciously like agent provocateurs. So, also, if Essex Police were worried about violence, why did they escort Socialist Worker Party activists to the front line when they had already put in their newspaper, drive the Nazis out of Essex? So they define the concerned parents of Epping as genocidal mid-century German white supremacists. Because presumably there are a bunch of Dutch Jews being housed in the Bell Hotel. Ah yes, you are hiding the Ethiopian sex offender in the attic, are you not? If the police knew that this is what the socialist worker thought of these parents, why bring them right next to each other? If violence had already kicked off after they'd escorted them there, why, as Laurie Wastel points out from a now deleted page on Essex Police's website, did they then, the following night, go to put anti-hotel protesters and counter-protesters next to one another in metal fences that could be easily torn down? Why did they continue to do this in the following days, when Stand Up to Racism agitators turned up with the trans pride flag for some reason? And refugees' welcome signs, even though said refugee is allegedly a sex offender. Why are Essex Police doing this? Do they want to provoke conflict as a pretext to crack down on the legitimate, law-abiding, peaceful protests of Epping's parents and others across the country that have started, inspired by this act of solidarity and concern for their children's well-being? Do they want to crack down on this because, as Liz Lloyd said, the Labour government needs a more forceful policy on law and order, which is, as Dominic Cummings suggested, code for the far right, brackets, white people? It's hard not to get conspiratorial when Epping Essex Police keep lying about the protest in Epping. So then the Epping Council voted to close the migrant hotel. This is despite one of the Conservative councillors, by the way, completely disgraceful, comparing the parents also to Nazis. This is despite the father of the alleged victim of the alleged migrant sex attack, saying that he stands with the protesters and supports what they do. So she's just slandering concerned mums as Nazis. Absolutely egregious. The council voted to close the hotel. Good on them. The Home Office still hasn't responded. They could well block it. Because originally their Bell Hotel was housing women and children who, one may argue, have a legitimate asylum claim. I think Britain is so far from every conceivable war zone and so culturally distant from all these countries that we shouldn't have to actually take in anyone. There are plenty of safe countries in their continent of origin that could house them much better. But by the by, if you were going to make the argument that there might be some women and children that we could house, while turfing them out for single male asylum seekers, illegal migrants, who commit disproportionate sex offences, yeah, it's kind of easy how that could inflame community tensions. And for a Conservative councillor to call people, parents, concerned about that, Nazis, absolutely disgraceful. So, Home Office hasn't responded, as of time recording, hasn't commented, might still block this, but within hours, turns out, these men are being moved from the Bell Hotel to the 4-star Britannia International in Canary Wharf. Now, the hotel itself has denied this, but then they started putting up fencing and bussing in mattresses and bringing in new supplies. So, protests started out there. Organic protests. And again, within moments, Stand Up to Racism materialise to chant, "Say it loud, say it clear, refugees are welcome here, no borders, no nation, stop deportation. We are women, we can fight, we don't need the fascist right." I mean, he does look effeminate enough to be a woman. And "Saving children's your disguise, you are Nazis organised." Remember, this is what these people support. Charged with 3 counts of sexual assault, 1 of inciting a girl to engage in sexual activity, and 1 of harassment without violence. These people support bringing more of those men here. These women support bringing more sex offenders to this country. That is the end result of their policy. They know what they are protesting against, which is concerned parents trying to stop sex offenders coming to the country, and they do it anyway.
Refugees are welcome here! Say Lord, say clear! Refugees are welcome here!
Draped in the trans pride flag, incapable of switching up their NPC programming, screaming their throats out till they're hoarse. Who are these people? Anyone asking this question? I haven't seen any MPs ask it in Parliament yet, and it is important considering they play an outsized role in our politics, a massive impact on our media. For example, last summer, conspicuously, in August, when there were meant to be hundreds of far-right riots that didn't materialise, multiple newspapers ran front covers, despite being of different ideological persuasions like the Mail, the Mirror, the Times, and the Guardian, of this photo of Stand Up to Racism protesters, with all the same placards, presenting them as anti-racism protesters, or a unified front fighting the far right, a purely organic representation of the British public, and they were all the same image. Very strange, that. So, I launched a Freedom of Information request with my friend Lewis Brackpole to ask, just with a sample of these 4 front pages from August the 8th, 2024, if whether or not the government's Don't Look Back in Anger unit, RICU, R-I-C-U, the Research, Information and Communications unit at the Home Office, which, in the aftermath of terror attacks or during civil unrest, controls the front page of newspapers, controls news coverage of these events, and buses imams and faith leaders out to the site for photo ops. I asked whether or not they had any involvement in this, whether they haven't had any involvement in organising the protest, funding it, whether they had any involvement in the front pages that were published the following day by those newspapers. And the response from the Home Office was, well, we didn't write the headlines. Right. If and when a government that is sufficiently transparent takes power and releases all the files the British state has on the psyops it has waged on the public, if and when that happens, we will find out just how much manipulation has been centrally planned by the government. And, okay, let's say purely hypothetically, Stand Up to Racism, the Socialist Workers Party, had nothing to do with the state, with intelligence agencies, with the Home Office itself. We still know that the Home Office has funneled money to the Paul Hamlin Foundation and other grievance industrial complex charities like Hope Not Hate to assemble what they call local migrant leaders, to assemble the sort of rapid response activist chapters to go out on the streets and agitate on behalf of mass immigration, a permissive asylum system, multiculturalism, anytime a spontaneous protest, like the ones in Epping, come up. And then their mere presence is used in newspaper front pages to say, well, anyone concerned about immigration is a member of the far right. So this is and Charlotte Gills reported on this on the Paul Hamlin Foundation very well, a network of leaders and organisations within towns who will respond to local needs and pressure points and share learning to enable rapid response to provocative elements. And so between 2020 and 2023, the Paul Hamlin Foundation received 1.36 million in government grants. That's in our tax money. I actually wrote about this in a piece for Courage Media right here, entitled "The British Public is Afraid and have had enough and the state is afraid." And there's a conspicuous amount of suggestions that, okay, even if Stand Up to Racism were not the direct beneficiaries, as alleged, of taxpayer subsidies, even if they haven't been collaborating with the mainstream media to distort the perceptions of the British public about the unpopularity of admitting thousands of foreign sex offenders at our expense, well, their members certainly are paid by the state, because it turns out they're backed by major trade unions and also MPs. So Diane Abbott and Bell Ribeiro Addy, Labour MPs, quite senior Labour MPs really, are speaking at Stand Up to Racism event very soon, alongside Mohammed Kosbar, who was a former member of the Met Police's Muslim Advisory Council and also is one of the chairmen of Finsbury Park Mosque, and a former General Secretary of the Muslim Council of Britain, which is meant to be banned from engaging with Whitehall and government, but that's not been upheld. Kosbar was removed by the Met Police because he praised the founder of Hamas as the master of the martyrs of the resistance after October 7th, which is just, a promise to repeat October 7th here in Britain against the British. Diane Abbott and Bell Ribeiro Addy think that's just fine, and so apparently does Keir Starmer, because he allows them to stay in the party without kicking them out. There's Diane Abbott in a keffiyeh and the least convincing wig of all time. Its other members include influential heads of unions. That includes the Vice President, Daniel Kebede. He's the General Secretary of the National Education Union, which is the largest education union in Britain. Stand Up to Racism were posting to members of the National Education Union materials to get them to come to counter-protests against Tommy Robinson's demonstrations in London, and encouraging them to put their materials in classroom displays and create after-school clubs to fight fascism. So this is a communist agitator group that is led by a member of the largest teachers' union in the country that is feeding communist activism into classes. So they're at least supported and partially bankrolled by the state. Also, Mick Whelan, who's a vice chairman of Stand Up to Racism and the Socialist Workers Party, is also general secretary of ASLEF, the train union that brought the rails to a halt for 2 years before Labour got into power to basically frustrate the prior Conservative government, because even though the Conservative government were doing everything in terms of social progressivism that the unions wanted, there was still a little bit of friction and non-compliance by some elements in the Conservative Party, and they knew that the Labour Party is totally on board with their agenda and is why they won't punish any of their MPs for going to these Stand Up to Racism events, which speakers of which have glorified Hamas. So they are state-paid agitators. They're used by the media to gaslight us in front pages. And this is why, when we start to notice this on social media, the state's only response is to censor us. So the Online Safety Bill came into effect and has been censoring everything from protest footage to Katie Lamb's speech about the grooming gangs in Parliament for people who have not verified their age online. But also atop the 12,000 arrests every year for social media posts, atop the increased recording of non-crime hate incidents for Islamophobia, as promised by Yvette Cooper, atop the new definition of Islamophobia being invented by Angela Rayner and Dominic Grieve, in the midst of the grooming gang scandal, by people, Angela Rayner and Dominic Grieve, who previously supported the all-party parliamentary group on British Muslims' definition of Islamophobia, which said it was racist to talk about the grooming gangs at all. Atop all of that, they're now inventing a new police squad to monitor anti-migrant posts on social media. So their only method of preventing civil unrest is actually accelerating the likelihood of civil unrest by confiscating our ability to seek redress for our grievances via speech, diplomacy, and the democratic vote. Instead, they have now assembled this new police force via the Home Office. This police force is called the National Internet Intelligence Investigations Team, and it works out of the National Police Coordination Centre in Westminster, as directed by the Home Secretary, the Home Office, the Civil Service, and most likely the same employees at Raiku, who tell us don't look back in anger anytime an Islamist goes and blows up a pop concert, or, as we see here, an Ethiopian allegedly attacks a 14-year-old girl. So I'm inclined to agree with Professor David Betts here. The state has adopted such a superposition personality, as Cummings would say, that it tells itself these ideologically fictions. It casts a kind of spell over itself to maintain the illusion of control, and half believes it and is half petrified that the ideology they're telling themselves isn't true, so they sort of have to believe it more to stop themselves from feeling anxious. I think they're so deluded there's no political off-ramp. And I am worried, because there needs to be a political solution that arises soon to prevent widespread civil unrest, but as the discourse accelerates, I think everyone's getting more and more worried that it won't. Is crime really decreasing in London? Well, according to people like Sebastian Salek, who is a councillor and a former political journalist, also writing threads on how Labour is fixing Britain, yes, apparently so. Now, I know that you might have lying eyes to disbelieve if you've boarded the tube or walked along the street or gone to areas like Wood Green anytime recently, where you might have felt unsafe. You might have felt the need to take your Rolex watch off or ditch your jewellery if you're particularly wealthy going through boroughs like Chelsea or Kensington. And that's because there are roving bands of bandit clans who listen to drill rap and wear balaclavas over their face and scoot along the pavement on their electric e-bikes, snatching purses and phones out of people's hands, being caught on camera, of course, or dueling one another with machetes and occasionally killing a member of the public as they do battle for their honour. You might feel unsafe because of all those people, but don't worry, the graph is telling us that crime is actually going down. I'm going to address these claims in this video, but we'll start with this thread. Apparently, according to Sebastian, London is thriving and the right can't stand it. They talk down our capital city constantly, but the city is measurably becoming a better place to live. 6 facts to shatter their doom narrative. We go to the first one, which already has a community note on it. London is getting safer. Knife crime is now lower than it was in 2016. The murder rate fell 28% from 2019 to 2023. Now, note he says 2019, because we spent 2 years basically under house arrest, and London was entirely empty, so people couldn't go out and kill one another. And then it says to 2023. Right. What happened between 2021 and 2023? That would be the Boris wave, when millions of unwanted third world migrants, net tax dependents, 95% of whom we are paying to have here because they don't contribute anything fiscally, let alone culturally, that is when they came to this country. 47% of social housing in the capital city is occupied by foreign nationals, is headed by foreign nationals. That means even more is headed by second-generation British-born British citizens, but, of course, themselves, children of immigrants, who repeat the same criminal and economic patterns of their parents. And so, just an abstract hypothetical here. I know left-wingers struggle with per capita and abstract hypotheticals, but imagine how much lower the crime rate would be if none of those people were here. And the reason I say that is because per capita, disproportionately, those people are committing a lot of crime, including knife crime and murder. If we go to the Met Police itself, and the Mayor of London, and the London Assembly, where they're getting these statistics, despite making up only 13% of London's population, black Londoners account for 45% of London's knife murder victims, 61% of knife murder perpetrators, and 53% of knife crime perpetrators. So this is largely black Londoners, so second-generation youths, largely in gangs, from Somalia, Nigeria, and the not-so-democratic Republic of Congo, who are just killing each other, and occasionally catching law-abiding members of the population in the crossfire. If you go to the Met Police's gang matrix as well, they've got a breakdown for between 2022 and 2024 for the ethnic compositions of their gangs. So the ethnicity breakdown: 72 white offenders, 364 black offenders, 28 Asian offenders, 16 other offenders, and 16 not recorded offenders. So the massive number of black offenders here. They're not just an overall majority, but it's even worse when you do per capita, because, well, they say 13% of London's total population. One, we don't actually know the demographic breakdown because the 2021 census is now wildly out of date thanks to the Boris wave, but of course, as well, 13% is not quite right because overwhelmingly they're male. There's literally one woman in the gang matrix here. So this will be black men between the ages of 16 and 30. So that's, what, 4% of the population are responsible for a disproportionate amount of knife, gun, and gang crime in the city. But don't worry, apparently it's all getting safer. Then we go on to this bit. London's air is getting cleaner. This is just an aside point, just to show how they distort facts. ULEZ has apparently helped to achieve, that's the ultra-low emission zone tax that Sadiq Khan has imposed via surveillance cameras in London boroughs that recognise your licence plate and then charge you a fine every day if your car isn't ULEZ compliant. Apparently it's achieved 54% less nitrogen oxide in London, 99% more clean air at monitoring sites versus 2019, and air quality improving faster than the rest of England. Bear in mind, I don't believe a word of this, because Sadiq Khan himself tried to hush up scientists who disputed his ULEZ claims back in 2023. In private emails seen by The Telegraph, Shirley Rodriguez, the London Mayor's Deputy for Environment and Energy, told Professor Frank Kelly she was really disappointed that Imperial College London had publicised findings questioning the effectiveness of ULEZ. Professor Kelly, a director of Imperial's Environmental Research Group, which has been paid more than £800,000 by Khan's office since 2021 to 2023, agreed to issue a statement partly written by Rodriguez saying ULEZ had helped to dramatically reduce air pollution. So anything coming out of Sadiq Khan, or most of academia at this point, is just pravda. It's just propaganda to get you to abandon your independent means of transport and pay to subsidise a transport system that said black youths, disproportionately, are not paying for. This is why Robert Jenrick decided to do that video at the tube stations, catching people who were almost all white, but that's because, frankly, if you confronted a black youth, you're more likely to get stabbed, seeing the numbers, but for evading the fares by just barging through the barriers. Now, in my personal experience, because I travel into London quite a lot, and this is just a small sample, but anecdotes do build a broader picture, every single time I've seen this at London Bridge or on the London Underground, it has been black youths. And the reason is, if you permit dysfunctional behaviours for children from broken homes, which disproportionately black kids in Britain do have, then you are going to get more of that behaviour. You get more of what you tolerate. And so if calling young black kids on their poor behaviour is called racist, then nobody calls them out on their bad behaviour, even when it's killing other young black kids and costing law-abiding, tax-paying commuters a lot more money. You're just going to get more of that. Okay, on to the next claim. London is a diversity success story. This is genuinely a article of faith for these people. Like they will never renounce, no matter how much evidence you present to them, the idea that diversity is our strength, which is a slur, by the way, against the native population, because it implies that if we had not been subjected to mass migration, we've seen more migration since 1997 to 2025 than between 1066 and the Second World War. We were fine for over 1,000 years. But if we had not seen such wide levels of mass migration, then we would be weak and feeble and not worthy of note on our own terms. So diversity as our strength is an insult against the native population. Always remember that. But he claims over 300 languages spoken. That's not a good thing. It's not a good thing at all. It atomizes people. It means that people can never get to know one another's neighbours. Just there's this belief, Eric Kaufman writes about this in White Shift, by certain metropolitan liberals that just more heterogeneity, more variety is itself exciting and bohemian, and their ability to tolerate it or express curiosity for it shows a virtuous open-mindedness on their part. Whereas the somewheres, in David Goodhart's formulation of somewhere versus anywhere, sort of rooted people who like creature comforts, who like familiarity, who like their neighbours, the community, their congregation, they are backwards and close-minded and actually racist and exclusionary because they don't want to open up their home, as in their national home, to everyone from anywhere with no hope of ever getting to know them. So no, I don't agree with your value judgment that all of these languages is a success story. I think it's actually a social asset. 46% BAME population. So they're just explicit about the fact that the growth of a non-white population is itself something to be celebrated, which implies that a homogeneous white population, let's say English population, is itself flawed, undesirable, immoral somehow. So when they say diversity is our strength, they mean non-white people. And I don't want to judge based on skin colour, but they do. So just understand the mindset of the people whose policies lead to more murders, more gang violence, and as we'll see, more sexual assaults very shortly. And then finally, he says, and still no no-go zones. Well, not if you're a British woman. So according to the Centre for Migration Control in new FOI data that they've produced, in 2024, between 40 and 47% of people charged in London for sexual offences, men charged of course, were foreign nationals, despite them accounting for just a quarter of the capital's official population. Again, this is not by ethnicity, this is by nationality, because the British government is particularly opaque as to the data concerning the atrocities it has inflicted on us as a matter of its immigration policy, and so they don't provide an ethnic breakdown. But you can, by proxy, since the data we see in Denmark and the Netherlands shows that second-generation migrants repeat the same patterns as their parents, extrapolate out from this, if you were to have the ethnic data, that the levels of crime are much, much higher than just 50%. So more than half of all sex offences committed in London are committed by non-Brits, as in non-natives. And they've got a league table here. At the top of that is Afghanistan. So Afghanistan, I mean, Afghan men commit sex offences at a rate 22 times that of British nationals. Again, not ethnicity breakdown, just passport breakdown. So some of those sex offenders on the British side of things will be British by paperwork only. But Afghans, as a matter of government policy by the last government, they took out a super injunction to hide it from us. Thousands of Afghans, including Taliban fighters, corrupt Afghan regime officials, militants and sex offenders, were imported here with the cost of at least £7 billion to the taxpayer without the public knowing about it until very recently. So it is British government policy to battery farm sex offenders at taxpayers' expense, and yet people like Sebastian think that's fine. You don't need to know about that. Actually, the government has been improving things by continuing this policy. Afghans were followed in the sex offender league table by Eritrea, Algeria, Somalia, Sudan, Albania, Iraq, Iran, Egypt, and Morocco. Now, other than Eritrea, which is a roughly 50-50 split, all of these are Muslim-majority countries. I'm seeing a pattern here. We can see a pattern just by looking at the state of the countries where these people are coming from. And turns out that the soil that a person stands on does not create the country that they live in. It's actually the people in aggregate that create the conditions of a country. And so if you move thousands of those people over here, especially young men, they're going to recreate the conditions of the country they fled. So if you import the third world, you get the third world, and you get the third world's treatment of women. We could just ban all of the foreign nationals from these countries from ever coming into Britain. But we don't. And so, if you're a woman and girl, walking around London, unprotected, without a chaperone, you are at risk. It is, in many areas, a no-go zone for you. But again, Sebastian just doesn't care about that. He doesn't care about our wives, sisters, mothers, and daughters who might be sexually assaulted by a man who never needed to be in this country in the first place. And yet again, every single one of these crimes is a consequence of government policy. It doesn't matter if overall crime is going down when you are still importing criminals. And every single crime that is committed by that foreign criminal never needed to happen. They never needed to be here. Which means that the government is to blame, and government policy can return them. They can stop them from ever coming in again, and we can actually have a safe capital city. We can actually have safe streets. We can actually see crime going down. But if you're running interference with lies like this, saying that actually all of these men being here and speaking their own languages and living according to their own customs is a good thing despite the sexual assaults, which he doesn't mention, if we have that mentality, then there will be more crimes committed like this. And the current government does. And who else has this mentality is Fraser Nelson. I feel, again, like the fish in SpongeBob. How many times do I have to teach you this lesson, old man? Fraser Nelson has been arguing with Nigel Farage because he's been attempting to keep reform on the Liberal plantation, and some within Reform have gotten wise to it and decided to get tougher on law and order instead. And by saying that there is a breakdown of law and order in the country, you are implicating mass immigration and multiculturalism as having failed. You are saying, as the statistics point out, that it is not the white British host majority who have gotten a lot more stabby or sexually assaulty in recent years. And it is also not the case that immigration has been an integration miracle, as Fraser Nelson once wrote. And even when presented with the facts of the Pakistani grooming gang scandal, even after inadvertently causing the national conversation to go global and cascade into the national inquiry that Labour have been dragged kicking and screaming to announcing, Fraser is still insisting this isn't a problem. So he knows exactly what he's doing, by the way. But Nigel Farage has said Britain is out of control. We all know crime is going up and not down. Most of us don't even bother to report it. And Fraser is going, Farage isn't fighting with me. He's fighting with 25 years of crime data, hospital A&E admissions data, and more. But perhaps it's a test. Can he get this lawless Britain narrative going in spite of the facts? The only way he would be able to get this lawless Britain narrative going is if people actually feel it for themselves. Because it's much harder to enforce a narrative that just isn't true onto people. You've got to build a kind of entire consensus reality, which Fraser Nelson has been an architect of throughout the Cameron years, insisting that mass immigration is just going all tickety-boo. But if Nigel Farage is saying obviously true things, then yes, he will get people to have a preference cascade towards his message, Fraser. And I think that's what you're afraid of. Now, Fraser himself is citing data that doesn't stand up to scrutiny, because he's presenting this graph here from the crime survey for England and Wales, unavailable for 2020 to 2021 because of COVID-19, of course, which then points out, this massive data gap, which is the reason why knife crime is registering as lower in Sebastian's figures. But anyway, Fraser points to this, and it shows that crime is dropping till 2020, and then starting to tick up for all crime, for theft, for neighbourhood crime, and for violence. And Fraser is dismissing this as a non-issue. There's no such crime wave. Now, Adam Wren, who Fraser has blocked, along with me, because we are confronting him with uncomfortable facts, has broken this down in this tweet thread. So he says, lots of other data sets show crime is up. This one data set shows it's down. This is the crime survey for England and Wales. The problem is with their methodology, because they conduct face-to-face doorstep interviews about victimization rates. So that is entirely subjective. That is contorted by their sampling areas. So, as Adam points out here, they sample middle layer super output areas and lower level super output areas, meaning low density neighbourhoods. So they don't go to the most crime-ridden areas of London to conduct this survey. They also don't account for crimes like shoplifting, which helpfully former Home Secretary and then Prime Minister Theresa May decided to decriminalise below 250 quid. similar to the sort of thing that the Americans used to have in California, where below $1,000 shoplifting was free, and so you got these massive shoplifting gangs running in and raiding designer stores. So now you just get endless videos of inner city youths running into shops and clearing off the shelves, and this is why we now have security tags on things like coffee and meat, because social decay has happened to such an extent where shops are being raided for their steaks or their Nescafe. And security guards don't dare confront them because, one, the security guard could themselves be arrested for trying to defend the shop's property, but two, because these men might have knives and they might be willing to use them because they have no concept of compassion. They don't value life in and of itself. They think that your worth is instrumental to them getting what they want, and so they have no qualms about stabbing you to death for a packet of cigarettes. And this is the crime we're dealing with. And also, this crime has specifically gone up, according to whistleblowers in The Sun last week, from Westfield Shopping Centre and Oxford Street, who say that about 70% of all the shoplifting that they're seeing now is committed by asylum seekers, so illegal migrants, living in hotels at British taxpayers' expense. That's not counted in this survey. So that's one of the leading crimes that's going up, as is all other types of theft where you report it, you get given a crime number, and the police don't follow up on it and instead sit back at their desk with a couple of digestive biscuits to start monitoring tweets instead, including that new Home Office unit that is monitoring anti-migrant sentiment online. All of those crimes aren't included in this survey, and this survey has distorted methodology. So Adam points out the methodology uses single occupancy dwellings only, so no houses of multiple occupancy, and that includes young professionals living in London because it's too expensive to live on your own, but also the massive growth in houses of multiple occupancy because of mass immigration. And they say here, the justification, they oversample people living as one family in their own home, who are richer, in worse areas, because this is fine because of some pre-immigration report from 2008. So they're working off of data from 17 years ago. So again, none of this is trustworthy. And again, what crimes are being recorded? It asks if they've been personally victimized, and it doesn't measure crimes against businesses, shoplifting, or criminal damage. Now, criminal damage is part of the UK aesthetic that we see, where trains, shop fronts, monuments have all been defaced with inarticulate graffiti, as if the entire city is one great big third world shantytown. This isn't recorded either. I mean, look at the state of the tubes, that now vigilante gangs of graffiti cleaners have, from Looking for Growth, have had to go and clean and been reprimanded by TfL. Also doesn't include petty crimes like bumping the tube barriers, which has been chronic and they've only started to crack down on because Robert Jenrick embarrassed them. So all of this is fundamentally dishonest, and Adam wrote another post here just summarising this information and pointing out that people modify their behaviour to avoid being victimised. And this is the thing that Fraser Nelson doesn't understand. People will go into London less. People will visit their capital city less if they're afraid of being victimised. Now, I want to reiterate to Fraser Nelson, because, again, he cites this graph up here, saying that it's not a crime wave because it's barely ticking up. Fraser, can you imagine how much lower that graph would be if we weren't importing criminals? Because Adam makes the point somewhere in this thread that Britain's population is aging, Gen Z isn't drinking, which means that they are less likely to commit crimes, they're more likely to stay at home online on video games, which means that they're not going out and joining gangs. So who is committing the crimes? Well, if you go to the far-right outlet, the Global Organised Crime Index, and you hover over the UK, now, it is second of all countries in Western Europe for crime. It is 10th of all countries in Europe, of the 44 countries, and it is 61 of 193 countries for crime around the world. So if you change the indicator here, let's go to foreign actors, so crime by foreign actors, and go to the UK, we are number 1 in Western Europe, number 2 in all of Europe, and number 18 of all countries. So we are mass importing criminals from around the world. So if you think that this graph looks good, imagine how good it would look if we stopped importing criminals, Fraser. But Fraser Nelson, who says that the Boris wave of post-Brexit migration was an accident, not a conspiracy, who says it's actually a positive that Britain is the only country who is growing at 1% a year purely due to migration because the working age population, not working population. He originally tweeted it out but deleted it because they aren't working. He thinks that's a positive, despite all of the crime they're committing, provably, in multiple instances, whether it's sex offences, whether it's theft, whether it's knife and gun crime, or whether it's just global organised crime the US government are tracking. And we know that Fraser knows this, because this is Fraser's long-term tactic. This clip was taken from 2016, and this is Fraser giving the game away about what he does. What he does, and what he advises the former Conservative government to do, is to act as a pressure release valve for public discontent anytime the Blairite, Cameronite, global neoliberal project arouses the ire of a population who have voted against mass migration in every election since 1974. What he says is, as a politician, all you have to do is say, I hear your concerns, while ignoring them, not doing anything substantive to address the issues, and continuing on with the project anyway.
What's her experience so far of her short premiership is if you persuade people that you're listening to what they have to say, that you don't reject their concerns as being bigoted or xenophobic, that if you talk in a language that is more in common with neglected voters than it is with the metropolitan fashionable elites, then that goes a long way. You don't have to come up with policies, banning immigrants or anything like that. All you need to do is to basically say to people, I hear your concerns. I mean, let's look at David Cameron. He actually, I think, did quite a good job here as well. Nobody expected him to win a majority in 2015, but he did. And he had a policy of cutting immigration by 2/3. Now, he completely failed in that target, but the fact that he had that target counted for a lot, because it meant people thought at least he wanted to control immigration. And there are a lot of parties in Europe right now, and governments in Europe, who wouldn't even say that they want to control it. They think that is dark territory that they don't want to go down. Now, it's funny.
But are you saying that this is only psychology, that as long as you say the right things, people will appreciate that, and that actual results do not really matter?
I'm not saying it's only psychology, but I think a large part of it is empathy rather than psychology. It is trying to say to voters, I'm on the same wavelength as you, I understand your concerns, they are legitimate concerns. I mean, the concerns people have about immigration are all usually very, very rational. Where are these people going to live, because housing is quite constrained? Where are they going to go to school? What impact will they have on the labour market? Will they mean my job is going to be less well paid? What about my children? Will they struggle to find a job? You need somebody to engage in that conversation. And when you do engage in that conversation, it goes a very, very long way towards establishing trust with the electorate and taking away the idea that nobody will listen to them apart from Le Pen and people like that. And this has always been the British way.
So, lie, gaslight them, pretend that you're going to do something, all the while telling them the reasons that they're concerned about their country becoming a strange land on their doorstep without them ever even asking are actually illegitimate, they're unwarranted, and confine the remit of legitimate concerns to purely logistical issues like school places, the busyness of the roads, the abundance of employment opportunities, and access to public services. Don't dare raise questions about identity, assimilation, cultural continuity, and crime. Notice he didn't even mention crime there. So Fraser Nelson has been pushing this line, deploying this tactic for years, nearly 10 years. And I must say, even his defenders at his former publication, The Spectator, who like him very much, are thinking, it's a bit transparent now. And the reason it's transparent is because it doesn't work in the day and age of social media where people can just pull your old clips or respond in real time to your lies with new facts and data. And this is why Fraser is so block happy, because he doesn't like people putting the corrections directly underneath his posts. Instead, if you ever encounter a Fraser Nelson tweet, go to the quote tweets and you'll find some factual information. But I want to return to Adam Wren's point here, because this is something that I saw yesterday when walking through Westminster. When he says that people augment their behaviours, that is true. The state also augments its behaviour in response to the crime that it permits. This is the concept of a narco-tyranny, which Katie Lamb was talking about the other day on Peter McCormack's podcast. She understands this very well. And that is, if you do not have external borders, you will have internal borders. Diversity only works under the conditions of a dictatorship. And this is why now, for the first time in hundreds of years of history, outside Westminster Abbey, there are, being assembled, barriers and metal detectors, probably for knives and or guns, because they're anticipating some kind of terror attack. As I published on Courage Media and explained a few weeks ago in a Tomlinson Talks episode, there are rumblings within the intelligence services, within the police, within the government, that there is a jihadist attack imminent, and what site would be better than Westminster Abbey, where the king himself was crowned. We didn't need to have this before the benefits of diversity. There were no Englishmen who ran around with machetes dueling one another on the Parliament Green. This was not a thing that needed to happen. This happened as a result of government policy. The government policies that Fraser Nelson and this Sebastian Salek chap and everyone in the Conservative Party that Nelson was advising supported. This doesn't need to happen. This can be undone by government policy. We could send all of these criminals home. We could never import them again. We could, as even Reform is suggesting now, build super prisons or send them to El Salvador in order to act as deterrents to serial offenders that join these London stabbing and shooting gangs. But for the time being, this injustice is being inflicted on us. Does this make you want to go to Westminster Abbey? Or does this discourage you alongside the ever-present threat of arbitrary violence, fatal arbitrary violence against you? Does this discourage you from visiting the landmarks and cultural heritage sites in your own capital city? Because we often talk about London as if it's lost. No, it's ours. Sorry, I was born here. Belongs to me, thank you very much. It doesn't belong to the Somali drill rap gangs that have made it borderline uninhabitable in most areas. So, does this make you want to go out there? And the answer is no. I observed this a little while ago when this scholar in question threw a footstool over the floor of the Stratford Westfield shopping centre, and him and his friends, recording it for TikTok or Instagram, ran off. These were juvenile miscreants, and I observed the impact that this has on individual decisions, whether or not to go out to shopping centres or museums or landmarks. In this post, when this video went viral, I'm just going to read this. When people say London is dangerous or that London has no-go zones, they are not referring only to areas that have been rendered unrecognisable and unsafe by demographic and cultural change, like Whitechapel or Tower Hamlets. They are also talking about these arbitrary, unpredictable, random acts of violence. An increasing number of stabbings, thefts, wanton property damage, and performative Mizzy-style crimes for social media are committed disproportionately by the exact demographics who benefit from soft-touch anti-racist policing. Law-abiding Brits find this unpredictability too stressful to tolerate and do not trust the police enough to prevent crime and protect them. So they, like me, spend less time in the capital city outside work, because you can never know when you'll be a victim of crime by impulse-driven miscreants like this who have no conscience. And even if these people are caught on camera nearly killing someone, when it goes to trial, it's not that deep, they say. And they then have the charge of criminal damage that recklessly endangered life dropped. Now, bear in mind, I'm just going to rewind this to look how close that was to that man. Look how close it was to them. They nearly killed multiple people. And yet, they've had the charge dropped. Oh, and remember, by the way, that when they originally appeared in court, 14 and 15-year-olds, the sentencing, or rather the charges, were delayed at Stratford Magistrates Court. The hearing was adjourned by the magistrate Anita Prem, good British name, because both sets of the boys' parents required interpreters. So both sets of their parents can't speak English. They're living here, probably in social housing. They've raised their sons to be performative miscreants who delight in the suffering, including the death of others, just for kicks and clicks. And yet, the justice system bends over backwards, not only to pay for their interpreters, not only does the entire state and tax system incentivize keeping these people here, but also They then give them a lighter sentence by dropping the charge of criminal damage that recklessly endangered life. And that is despite the boys themselves being unrepentant about what they did. So the prosecutor, Elizabeth Agi, said it's fortunate that nobody was injured. Both boys, though, in a victim impact statement, who told the police, the one who threw the seat, it's not that deep, it didn't hit no one. Now again, even he can't speak English. But they just don't care. They will, as I put, they will go as far as killing you to amuse themselves and feel no guilt about it. London is full of these people, and you're trying to tell me, Fraser, Sebastian, that it's safer. No, London will not be safer until every one of these people is either locked up or gone, deported. They should not be here. And stop trying to gaslight me that everything in my capital city is just fine, because it isn't. Kemi Badenoch is famously late to everything, to meetings, to her own leadership announcement speech in 2022 because she was getting a aide to deliver her a McDonald's in perhaps the most UK behaviour ever recorded. And it seems to political trends because her tactic of watchful waiting, of refusing to commit to a single policy because she's apparently working out the difficult details of policy behind the scenes, just isn't working. And the Conservative establishment, their friendly press, and even her own MPs are realising it and briefing against her. And it looks like for Kemi Badenoch, time is up. And we have a amusing history of her being called Laternoch or turning up 45 minutes late to meetings and then judging everyone else for being early, as documented in her unlicensed biography by Lord Ashcroft. There are criticisms of her when she used to work at The Spectator, saying that things were her top priority before leaving them unfinished. And there seems to be a recurring pattern here of Kemi being elevated beyond all reasonable expectations of the Peter Principle's ceiling on her ability to exceed, but also that she just doesn't deliver the goods as is promised. Mike Jones, who was one of her supporters, who's an excellent critic of migration policy, wrote in The Critic recently that she seems to have bought her own mythology as the second coming of Margaret Thatcher, but with diversity body armour. And that belief in herself as something akin to Daenerys Targaryen, who she says that she admires, means that she genuinely thinks she is the heir apparent to the right, and so that she's got it in the bag, and is either not amenable to advice to the contrary, or her own advisors, like Lee Rowley, are refusing to give her bad news and will only deliver her praise, which is inflating her sense of self-importance beyond all reason. And so, this sort of lateness to briefings has become so endemic that it actually became a source of humour, because during the Afghan scandal, where the last treacherous Conservative government took out multiple super injunctions to block from public knowledge the fact that they, due to an email leak from the Ministry of Defence, were secretly importing thousands of Afghans, including Taliban fighters, corrupt former government officials and sex offenders, at a cost of at least £7 billion to the British public, by the way. Kemi didn't know about this because she was offered a security briefing in March where she would have been told about the leak and the imminent lifting of the super injunction, but she actually didn't attend because she was late. And so sometimes being late can be her saving grace, but, well, turns out that her being too late to the rapid movement of politics from her position, which is essentially British values integration platitudes, a vague promise to control migration, and the need to feed all of one's arguments for the preservation of one's own nation through the mouth of someone with intersectional credentials, even if you're on the right. That position has been entirely left behind. It's the politics of 2010 and we're in 2025. And it shows that she really doesn't know what time it is, based on her recent reshuffle, where she promoted former leadership rival, former Home Secretary, and the most improperly named man in the world, James Cleverly, to the position of Shadow Minister for Housing, Levelling Up and Communities, Michael Gove's former role, so he can spar toe-to-toe with Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner. And this is very much the case of keeping your friends close but your enemies closer, because James Cleverly is favoured as the leadership rival by the Conservative establishment, who are still addicted to having, as Neil Ferguson told me at ARC, the case for integration be made to millions of unassimilable foreign nationals that they themselves brought in by a half or fully immigrant heritage or first-generation immigrant politician, like Kemi Badenoch or James Cleverly. They just want all of their positions to be repeated back to them by a black politician so that they don't feel white guilt about loving their own country. And I'm sorry, but the electorate are not only aging past you, because had the Conservative Party waited another 6 months to call the election by the deadline, 0.5% of their voter base would have just died off, but also discourse is moving so fast that the establishment Conservative position is unpopular and untenable. It is not only to blame for bringing Britain to the brink of civil unrest, economic ruin, and cultural disintegration, but also doesn't offer any sufficient solutions. It says, we just need stronger integration strategies. Okay, they haven't integrated. Now what? No answer. And so James Cleverly represents the Tory party that is to blame for mass migration, multiculturalism, the Afghan scandal, lockdown, the Online Safety Act, fiscal irresponsibility, all of these problems. But also, he has no contrition for the problems and no solutions. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that James Cleverly, when Kemi Badenoch was elected as the leader of the Conservative Party, tweeted out, "Labour are too pale, male and stale," showing his dripping contempt for the native population of this country. Here's the post in question, and I wonder if Cleverly has forgiven me for that particularly brutal ratio I gave. There should be no politician calling themselves conservative that speaks like this, that has such animus towards not only your own voters, but the native host majority, of which you are meant to be half, by the way, James, because your mother is English. What are you conserving if not the people of these isles from which the culture, the prosperity, the families, and the country flow? Nothing. Which is why the Conservative Party is in ruins. It is now being outnumbered in the polling by Reform UK. It was delivered a kicking at the last round of local elections, and they're gritting their teeth so hard that you could line the roads with them for next May's round of local elections, when they're expected to lose even more, and wondering whether to get rid of Kemi in November when they have the numbers, or after they've been sufficiently decimated in May, because they'll have even more of a mandate to remake the party in a revolutionary image, if there's barely anything left of it. CCHQ is empty. They're boasting about donors, but that's just because they want to keep the Carlton Club alive before they have to sell off the furniture as firewood. The Conservative Party's got nothing left, and imagine electing James Cleverly. But what's even more telling is in the reshuffle, and this is not detailed as much in the Financial Times piece, but it is in other pieces, is that she has changed out people behind the scenes. So she has gotten rid of Lee Rowley, who was her former closest advisor. It's been replaced by Henry Newman. Now, Henry Newman is a former special advisor to Michael Gove and to Francis Maud, who was the party chairman for David Cameron and Michael Gove, before Baroness Saida Vorsi, who obviously accused her own party of Islamophobia and is now constantly complaining that the entire country hates Muslims. By the by, the majority of the British public polled last week found them in favour of saying Islam is incompatible with British values. I would just say British traditions, because values can change, whereas traditions are a long and unbroken chain that stems from a particular people. But whether the wording is correct, they're right on instinct. Warsi is wrong, and the modernisers, as they call themselves, or the Cameroonians of the Conservative Party, that decided, again, like Cleverly, the party was too pale, male and stale. They needed all women and all minority shortlists that packed the party full of inveterate wets and incompetents like Priti Patel. Those people who destroyed the party just because they didn't like the fact that Theresa May had pointed out they were being called the Nasty Party and they wanted to be liked by The Guardian, or, as Dominic Cummings said infamously of Boris Johnson, he opened the floodgates to post-Brexit migration because he, quote, wanted the Financial Times to like him again. Those people have been utterly repudiated by the electorate. They are being punished at the last election, at all of the local elections, and they are the reason for the rise of reform. And yet, Kemi Badenoch has brought this person, Henry Newman, in as her advisor. Now, he is also Carrie Johnson's friend and was called the Chatty Rat, a sort of confidant who had leaked to the press, by Dominic Cummings. And Dominic Cummings put out the following tweet, and I think this is the death blow to Kemi Badenoch's premiership, because Dominic Cummings, despite his Barnard Castle fiasco, has been looked to as a credible voice on the problems that the Conservatives failed to address while in government. Now, anything Cummings says should be taken with a pillar of salt, because he is still friendly with Michael Gove. He is very much interested in rehabilitating Gove's image, while Gove is the editor of The Spectator now, and saying that Gove did the right thing, in all fairness, while at the Department of Education, and backing Andrew Norfolk at the Times to prevent a super injunction, blocking his reporting on the grooming gangs, and blocking the cover-up of child abuse that the Department for Education knew about. However, Cummings coming out and saying things as brutal as this tweet shows that the Tory party isn't keeping up the pretense that they have faith in Kemi winning in 2029 anymore. Neil Ferguson at ARC bet me on camera that Kemi Badenoch would be Prime Minister by 2029. I take checks, Neil. Anyway, Cummings tweeted about this reshuffle. Quote, "Great appointments by Kemi. I hate my Nigerian tribal rivals Badenoch. Cleverly, the last great defender of the Boris carry wave, proud defender of giving soldiers houses to Afghans, one of the architects with Boris of the disgraceful giveaway of Chagos, opponent of house building, loved by officials because he is pure NPC, will read out documents like the Chagos surrender with a straight face too. No questions ever asked, just say it's the legal advice minister and you can get him to say anything. Will fit in well with Kemi Badenoch's regime for its last few months. Also good to see Newman, pictured, standing alongside Keir Starmer at Camden Pride when Newman was a Camden Conservative councillor, is also super logical. One of those who worked with Carrie to support the mental trans rights Stonewall campaign, strengthen its grip on the Cabinet Office, co-campaigner with Starmer for Camden Pride, hope to see Wally, an advisor on national security, Carrie, an advisor on propriety and ethics, and one of the gay sex addict drug users in charge of family policy in this reshuffle. Dominic Cummings, in his own words, just called the Tory party the party of gay sex and stupidity. I think Kemi's cooked. You can't come back from that, I'm afraid. You're going to have to do a lot of explaining, but Kemi now has the aura of being in terminal decline, and especially because in the age of rising migration skepticism, on cultural, not just logistical grounds, a general pessimism about the prospect of integration, small fissures of difference will become reasons for distrust, feeling like someone is incapable of representing you if they're different from you. And so appointing a woman who identifies as a first-generation immigrant and not British, not English, but Yoruba Nigerian for whom other Nigerians are her ethnic enemies is not, as was extolled by the likes of Charles Moore on the Telegraph, a boon to the Tory party, making her impervious to accusations of racism, which they levelled Labour at Suella Braverman and Priti Patel anyway, so they're always going to call you racist no matter what. Instead, it's a liability for your own electorate, who just want to be led by an Englishman who is going to stop migration, and who does not have the baggage of throughout their career personally lobbying to lift the caps on student and study visas, as Kemi did in 2018. Now, Cummings expanded on his pessimism about Kemi in the following Substack post, and he writes, and he doesn't hold back, Kemi is lazy, brittle, and delusional, and he worked with her, remember, because he's good friends with Gove, who, Gove being Kemi's protege, and has consistently pushed Kemi in her 2022 leadership bid, even as recently as arguing with Matt Goodwin that Kemi is to the right of Reform and Nigel Farage, which some Tory ministers might actually be to the right of Reform, thinking Katie Lamb and Nick Timothy and even Robert Jenrick, in Farage's own words, but certainly not Kemi Badenoch. Kemi Badenoch uses stupid lefty white kids, or white as a pejorative when addressing David Tennant. That's an ethnic animus that does not fly with a new, younger right wing that Goodwin rightly points out is more concerned with questions of identity, belonging, and immigration than it is with the economic axis that was popular during the capitalism v socialism battles of the Cold War. Anyway, Cummings writes, Kemi is lazy, brittle, and delusional. In her previous jobs, she was useless but learned to blame others. She doesn't have any of the things needed for serious leader. The people who like her are A, people who've swallowed insider spin, or B, a subset of insider characters whose preferences and tastes are very far from the median voter. From all parts of the ideological spectrum, I hear identical lines. She won't listen to anybody. She picks fights with everybody. She meets a businessman who made a fortune in X and then explains why they're wrong about X. She's lazy and won't read. She sits in her office playing computer games on her iPad. She sees stuff on Twitter and just blurts it out. I can't see her developing in the job. Most spads and donors who created her did not work on her leadership contest because they got so disillusioned, people inside her inner circle are already telling friends, I can't see this working. Now, I actually did ask someone who had worked with Kemi whether or not this is true, and on the condition of anonymity, they gave me the following quote. Badenoch is a symptom of a hollowed-out Conservative Party. It's the end game of modernisers who care about optics over substance. They've killed the party. And they said that she didn't really read her briefs. And the very well-crafted speech by the likes of Munira Mirza against racist, anti-white racist DEI policies in 2021, in the aftermath of the Cultural Revolution following the death of George Floyd and the BLM riots in America that swept over Britain, where a majority of Conservative ministers at the time in government took diversity training. So, again, inveterate wets and traitors. Kemi Badenoch's speech pushing back against that was designed to propel her to stardom, but she'd had lots of prep, she'd had most of the research work done for her, and because of her identity, at the time, she was best positioned to make the case against black separatist, anti-white identity politics. But now the issue is immigration, her status as an immigrant is a liability, and her unwillingness to do any work will always put her behind the rapidly moving discourse which is accelerated because of the nature of the internet. And so, let's cast our minds back to the promotion that Kemi was receiving by the likes of Tory gargoyles like Charles Moore, similar Tory gargoyles like William Hague, who are currently backing James Cleverly as her replacement option at the moment. But Charles Moore wrote at the time, although originating in the centre, Robert Jenrick is now the more programmatically right-wing of the two. This may be because his time as immigration minister convinced him of the fundamental uselessness of Tory policy on the subject, also because his family is Jewish, his wife is American-Israeli, and October the 7th was a real wake-up moment for him, as it was for Suella Braverman, because when you have Muslims chanting in the street every weekend and Wednesday, along with a bunch of communists, saying, globalize the intifada from the river to the sea, and praising a group in whose charter it has the genocide of all Jews, you might think your family have come under threat and your government has made a mistake. But, to continue, Moore writes, he became angry at his party's promises, which could not, in the present state of the law, be kept. The iron entered his soul. Emotionally, therefore, Mr. Jenrick is close to the sort of voter who defected to reform. While in office, he came to realise he was thinking what they were thinking. He can therefore claim that he would be the sort of Tory leader who could win such people back. I originally remember that he was saying he was going to deliver the policies of Nigel Farage with the candour of David Cameron. Instead, what he's doing is he's delivering the policies of Rupert Lowe with the presentation of Nigel Farage, which is very good. But again, Jenrick also carries with him the baggage of suspected insincerity. I think he's personally sincere, but lots of voters will think he's insincere. His conversion from voting for the previous assisted dying legislation in 2017, being communities minister during the Boris wave, supporting the lockdown, voting for the online safety bill, to then going to sceptical of Stella Creasy's abortion amendment, the Labour government's assisted dying bill, being a hardliner on immigration, being very tough on crime, speaking about anti-white racism and English identity. People will think, well, how rapid can that conversion be sincere? And also, and again, I like Jenrick and I like his team and the people around him. Doesn't he just give off the vibe of Ron DeSantis at the moment? He's not Trump, right? He's Ron DeSantis. He's a slightly autistic, very competent governor who really hates his political enemies, understands the existential threat that they present, and will have no bones about crushing them with forthright and moral legislation. Good on him. But does he have political pixie dust? He at least needs more time in the tank to work on his persona. His videos have been seismic. They've really impacted political discourse, and he's been the most forthright about this. But he isn't a Trump figure. Maybe we don't need a Trump figure, but I think the reason that Nigel Farage is, or at least has been, consuming a lot of media attention and is still topping the polls is because he at least occupies the vacant spot of a Trump figure in the public imagination, despite the increasing awareness online and in print of his softening on certain issues. And so, can Jenrick do that? We don't know. But we certainly know that Kemi can't do that. Charles Moore sold Kemi to us as, for her, Kemi, it is less a matter of party, more a set of beliefs. Because of her ethnic background, she has direct encounters with the hostile ideologies that divide Britain and other Western countries through identity and sexual politics, which set people against one another and weaken families. She has an immigrant patriotism for this country, an emotion often underrated by those of us brought up here. Her memorable, striking eloquence comes from this. In terms of personality, Mr. Jemrick is cool-headed and therefore potentially unresonant with the public, and Mrs. Badenoch is fiery and therefore potentially troublesome. Having no vote in this contest, I'm a non-affiliated peer, I look at it with some detachment. I would say that it would be unwise to overlook the obvious. A black African woman leading the oldest political party in the world would be a sight for sore eyes. The left's cant phrase in relation to racism, lived experience, would come back to bite them. Sir Keir, never eloquent, would be at loss for words. Unfortunately, Kemi has been trounced multiple times at P&Qs by Keir Starmer because she looks shaky and unprepared, and why would it be a sight for sore eyes to be led by a black African woman? I don't agree. I think, one, the most qualified candidate should have won the leadership election. I don't think Kemi was the more qualified candidate. But two, I think it's actually better for England to be led by English people. I think it's better for Nigeria to be led by Nigerians. I think it's better for the Japanese to be led by the Japanese. I think it's better for Israel to be led by Jews. I think it's better for pretty much every country to be led by its own people. And so I don't actually think that Kemi, who identifies as first-generation immigrant Yoruba, for whom it would be a slight liability to shut the borders to people who share her identity as an immigrant, I don't think that's a good idea. It's why she seemed hesitant in her trigonometry interview to put any country on a red list, because she left open the possibility that hypothetically there might be one rocket scientist from Pakistan that merits allowing in all of the grooming gang perpetrators. Because she herself sees herself as that exceptional individual from Nigeria, and so she doesn't want to exclude the possibility that exceptional individuals can come from certain countries, when, on pure probability, very rarely happens. So, it's a liability, not a strength. Actually, I remember Harrison Pitt wrote a piece at the time criticising this sort of line of thought from Charles Moore in the European Conservative. And he and I and Georgia Gilholly and Stephen Edgington and Nick Dixon were all chastised as the very online right, which is just code for racist, for saying, well, do we think that Kemi is being overhyped? Do we think that actually this is a bad strategy to promote an immigrant to the top of your party at a time of immigrant skepticism? And the Tory old guard, like Francis Maude, who I mentioned before, who has been appointed one of Kemi's advisors now, despite leading the Cameron Conservative Party to ruin, along with the likes of Gove and Cameron, who are in Kemi's corner. We were saying, is it actually the best idea to do this? And we were derided and dismissed, but actually Harrison put it best when he said that Moore has been spellbound by this fantasy of being led by a black girl boss who the left can't call racist, even though they will call her racist, and so has overlooked her flaws and has now bet the entire house on Badenoch. And there are quite a few people also at the roulette table wondering if they should have put their money on red instead. And so these promises of moments of firebrand salience, of telling it like it is, haven't happened. They almost happened the other day, as I note with this GB News clip with Camilla Tominey, where Camilla asked about Starmer's then upcoming announcement that Labour were going to recognise an independent Palestinian state. And she asks, are you a Zionist? And Kemi, quite cleverly, said, I don't know what people mean by Zionist, because of course the term constantly shifts and moves and is very subjective, and brought the conversation back to the threat posed by global and also domestic Islamist terrorism to Britain. And she was doing really well until the very end, when she said, and this shows her poor instincts, that it is in particular bad for peaceful Muslims who just want to go about their lives. No, it isn't. Actually, said peaceful Muslims just have a doctrinal dispute with the core faith claims of Islam with their more devout, jihadist, closer reading brethren. It's actually way worse for the British public who don't want to live in a Muslim country in the first place. And if Kemi truly tells it like it is, and her immigrant heritage gives her this sort of sacred way of knowing that we ignorant Brits are inaccessible to, she would know from Nigeria and her ethnic enemies that actually Islam and Christianity cannot coexist because Islam will never leave Christians alone. And instead, she still feels the need to buffer her arguments with this hypothetical under siege minority group who she is defending, rather than saying Islam is incompatible with British traditions, as the majority of the country think, and she can consider herself among our tribe if she likes, because she's married to Hamish Badenoch, who himself is Scottish, and so she has half-native children. She would say, this being our home, she keeps saying this is our home and not a hotel, we feel Islam is incompatible with Britain and we do not want it here. And we can defend our home on its own terms, not our home as a safe haven for these hypothetically moderate Muslims who don't really exist. I mean, the majority, again, it's 2/3 of British-born Muslims living in Britain think Hamas did nothing wrong on October the 7th. So this constituency doesn't exist. So who is Kemi representing? She is only representing the gargoyles of the Conservative Party who led the party and the country to ruin, who want their opinions repeated back to them by an articulate black politician. And it's just not the time for that. It's the wrong time. As Cummings says, Kemi just doesn't get it. She is appointing the wrong people. And this messaging, that she is Britain's Javier Milei, also won't cut it. For two reasons. One, your brand of fiscal chainsaw-wielding libertarianism doesn't include cutting the triple lock on pensions and reassessing NHS spending, because you know that it is politically radioactive for the boomer donor and voting class, which is all the Conservative Party has left right now. So how much money can you actually cut? But also, purely fiscal concerns are not the concerns of the new right, as Matt Goodwin has written in his new policy exchange paper. So just talking about purely logistical and economic issues will not sate the appetites of people who are pessimistic about demographics, integration, and immigration. And so the only thing Kemi has is her immigrant identity, which itself is a liability. There's no getting around it. This is why I think her premiership is in terminal decline. And so you've now got pieces in The Spectator by a new writer, Tim Shipman, formerly of the Times, I believe, who's come over, who is being told by members of the Conservative Party and MPs that they're basically doomed. He's getting quotes, for example, from a shadow minister saying, the polls are absolutely horrific. Kemi's personal polling is in Liz Truss territory. There is no precedent for it. People say, let Kemi be Kemi, but there are increasingly few don't knows, and they are moving against us. We are being frozen out in the national conversation. There was another piece in The Spectator by Shipman on whether or not reform can be stopped, where he spoke to a CCHQ source who had said, the operation is a shit show. They had so little power and were sick of carrying the can for failure, which is why there are so many resignations. And another aide, apparently, said that during a focus group, Badenoch was described by one voter as repulsive. Again, it's right there in the Cummings tweet. This is just the vibe of the Tory party. It's corruption, sleaze, sexual impropriety, ignorance, and being responsible for bringing the country to the brink of ruin. And this is why this massive hit piece in the New Statesman by Will Lloyd, titled Kemi Badenoch Isn't Working, reminiscent of the Saatchi and Saatchi billboard Labour Isn't Working, which helped win Thatcher the election in 1979. This is why it's just full of quotes from Tory insiders. It's ruthless, frankly. Kemi would be doing better if she had hired Acme from Looney Tunes to conduct her PR and strategy for her. So there's a quote in here where it says, Richard Holden, the former party chairman, told a recent private dinner, according to one witness, that the shadow cabinet was full of non-entities, with his usual gift for gentle understatement. Dominic Cummings has called Badenoch lazy, brittle, and delusional. Meanwhile, Badenoch's preferred tactic has been to hide. Media appearances, never prolific, appear to have become even scarcer. According to those who have watched her operate up close, she has a habit of vanishing into her AirPods and iPad. Senior Tories complain that she is difficult to reach before 11 a.m. Her team says her working day starts early. She rarely leaves London to campaign in the regions. Asked on Westminster stages what her economic plan is, she talks instead about the social issues that fueled her rise, from gender clinics and trans people to a new concern, abortion, even though she's pro-choice. Evenings are spent doom-scrolling and making calls to editors and producers about trying to spike negative stories about her. Her husband Hamish absorbs the worst tweets, the ones she can't face. She is fragile and frightened. She's very bourgeois. She lives in the opinions of others. She's constantly trying to manage public perception rather than getting out ahead of it and giving people a reason to have faith in her. Again, sign of terminal decline. Continue. At PMQs, Badenoch's hands shake when she reads her lines from a piece of paper. Her backbenchers notice. On television, when she rouses herself to appear in the studios, Badenoch blinks more than she used to. Her donors notice. This is someone not enjoying the job. And there was a part in here where apparently her old notebook was found, where she says that she believes that she is the standard bearer of the right. So she feels this crushing pressure to live up to the expectations placed on her by Fraser Nelson and Neil Ferguson and Michael Gove and Charles Moore and all of these Tory old guard establishment figures who have brought the country and the party to its knees. But she's not capable of living up to it privately, according to these sources, at least. It's just not working. And as for criticisms, I mean, Lloyd addresses criticisms from folks that are derided as the very online right, which, I mean, that criticism mainly comes from Spiked, but that's moronic, because one, they're spiked online, so they acknowledge the power of online discourse, which means that they just hate the right, so they're positioning themselves as the left. So why would any right-wing party, ostensibly right-wing party like the Conservatives, take their advice on anything? Because they're leftists. But also, it's stupid because pretty much everyone's totally online at this point, or is at least one sphere of separation removed from someone who sources all of their news and political opinions from being online. And the amount of people I speak who work in Westminster, in influential think tanks, in MPs' offices, in pressure groups, who watch this show, even some of the clips that YouTube suppresses in the algorithm, and will talk to me about it, and say that they like my commentary and my writing, is important. So yeah, it doesn't just stay online. The maximum proof that it's not just a niche, very online right is, one, that Kemi Badenoch is allowing mean tweets to get to her, but two, the fact that an argument between Sam Bidwell and Fraser Nelson about his Telegraph column then led to Max Tempers, an anonymous account, posting a transcript from the Oxford grooming gang trial on Twitter, which then caught the attention of Elon Musk, which then dictated British politics to be focused for about a solid 6 months on whether or not there's going to be a national grooming gang inquiry. This scandal's gone on for decades, and it took a few tweets to finally get some movement on it after the tireless work of the likes of Andrew Norfolk and Charlie Peters and all sorts of other people. So it's not confined to the online space. But anyway, Will observes in this New Statesman piece, in a common parlance, I use the latter and not the former. It is this ungoverned space that hostility to Badenoch takes on a distinctly racialised tinge. I disagree with that. Her Nigerian heritage, once thought by Tory modernisers to be a strength, is now seen by young right-wing types as a weakness, especially as her party struggles to keep up with reform on illegal immigration and asylum. Their criticisms are beginning to be echoed by older right-wingers, such as Matt Goodwin, for example. More dangerous still to Badenoch's prospects is a very specific charge. It is said that she is failing to press home political attacks on the small boats crisis because she is worried it will invite scrutiny of the way her parents got her citizenship. The accusation that Badenoch is an anchor baby, a term that refers to the children of foreign nationals exploiting just solely citizenship laws, being born on soil makes you a citizen of that country. That her parents took advantage of British citizenship laws in the early 1980s to get their daughter a passport, has circulated for some time on the fringes of Tory and media circles and been denied in the past by Badenoch. I don't see how any other way of interpreting her parents coming from Nigeria to use the NHS to give birth to her, then returning to Nigeria, living in Nigeria and the US, and then sending her to study engineering as a teenager in Britain because she has British citizenship. I don't see any other way of interpreting that other than health tourism. It's the elephant in the room, said one source regarding the way Badenoch got her British citizenship. They compared Badenoch's parents, in crude terms, to small boat migrants crossing the Channel. Listening to them attack Badenoch in private, it becomes clear that for some Conservatives, Badenoch is a proxy for their fears about migration, and worse. There's a clear strain of racism in the remarks. How? How is it racism? Are they saying that she's inferior because she's black? No. They are saying that having a first-generation immigrant who doesn't identify as British but identifies as ethnically Yoruba, with ethnic Nigerian enemies, which if she became Prime Minister might have a bearing on domestic policy because we've imported so many Nigerians, but also international policy. We've got to worry about terror attacks from Boko Haram. that is all a very salient concern. And also it's a matter of representation, because if she doesn't identify as English, because she can't, or as primarily British, and if her being the beneficiary of Britain's opportunities and meeting her husband and having her children was only enabled by a permissive birthright citizenship scheme that was scrapped the year after she was born here, I don't see how any of that has to do with her race. I see all of that as being to do with her immigrant heritage being a liability and influencing the way she is governing in an age of migration skepticism. So this is just bad faith smears. But it says, they cringe when she asserts that her ascent from Nigeria to Tory leadership is proof that Britain still works. Yeah, because the premise is, if she wasn't Tory leader, Britain would be racist. Worse, they find it offensive. Britain doesn't work, that's the problem. And also, Britain would be fine without Kemi Badenoch here. Britain would be fine without any immigrant here. Britain was fine for generations. And given immigrants, I've met some of them, plenty of people that I know interpersonally. Given immigrants may themselves be nice people. We may actually want them here. But that doesn't mean that they need to be here for Britain to be a good country. And that is the premise in Kemi's statement. Britain is a good country, and the proof is that I've succeeded. No, Britain would be a good country whether or not Kemi Badenoch has succeeded. And the problem is, she isn't succeeding. And Lloyd quotes, while the idea of Olukemi Olufunto Adegoke Badenoch was always deeply seductive to a certain kind of Tory, the former academic and reform mouthpiece Matt Goodwin wrote in February, Matt supports reform, shock, unsubtly implying that Badenoch is not British by using her full name. She's not. She's British by citizenship, but she's Yoruba Nigerian. The idea of Kemi Badenoch is definitely not igniting the same reaction out there in the wider country, Matt writes. The optimism that marked an older generation of Conservatives like Fraser Nelson and boosterish Tory leaders like Johnson has given way in certain parts of the right to an astral pessimism about Britain, its demographics and its future. Yeah, it's called growing up in the Britain that they created. There is a deep pathos to Badenoch's slow-motion retreat into herself, refusing to face the reality of her position. And don't get me wrong, I feel sad that she is saddened by attacks online, but that just means she's not a cut out for the job, I'm afraid. She tries to keep everyone together and they stab her in the back, says her former staffer. You think you belong, you think you're attached to this institution, but it's full of backstabbers. According to this former staffer, Badenoch does not think the criticism directed at her is racist. Well, fair on her. She's far more sensible than Will Lloyd is in this piece. After all, if the Conservative Party was racist, how could she have ended up leading it? And the country, broadly, doesn't just hate people arbitrarily because of their skin colour, but they do see, as a fact, her immigrant heritage being a liability and an impediment to her being willing to draw up the drawbridge to future immigrants. And so I thought I'd finish on this, because shortly before Kemi Badenoch took over the party, while she was heading up Shadow Cabinet, while she was actually delivering the first Shadow Cabinet briefing, which was then leaked to the Times, where she called Suella Braverman the victim of a very public mental breakdown, I was kicked out of the Conservative Party. Mainly because I had opposed child gender transition. I had two other posts, one where I said before I was a member of the Conservative Party that I voted for reform in a local by-election, and the other because I said that reform, Lee Anderson should not have been kicked out of the Conservative Party and forced to defect to reform for criticising Sadiq Khan because Sadiq Khan made an entire legal career out of defending Islamic terrorists. However, the main reasons I was kicked out was because I opposed child gender transition and said the LGBTQ community is not family friendly because they can't reproduce without reproductive technologies that inflict injustices on children who can't choose their parents, and they have sterilized thousands of children in the name of a lie that you could change sex. So even though that's Kemi's position, I was kicked out of the party for that. And so I would just like to point out that most political commentary ages like milk, right? And that's fine, because it is necessary for the transient conditions under which observations are made. And all political commentary is, yes, a description of reality, but it is also an attempt to encourage or discourage certain policies or talking points. And so, political commentary has less permanence than philosophy, which ages like wine. However, this piece has aged like the wine in the Carlton Club seller. I had planned to write an article evaluating the merits and faults of each prospective leadership candidate, but whoever holds the crossbar puppeteering the corpse of that former election-winning institution is now irrelevant. If the Conservative Party is incapable of accommodating critics of its disastrous record in government, then it demonstrates its commitment to continuing the very status quo which delivered the worst, well-deserved election defeat for a century. The fact that the Conservative Party uses the ever-expanding LGBT acronym explains why it cannot mount a defence against its Labour, Lib Dem and Green counterparts. If not the innocence of children and the most basic biological distinction between the sexes, what on earth are the Conservatives in the business of conserving exactly? It certainly isn't the native host population of the country and their culture if they think that the likes of James Cleverly or Kemi Badenoch are the answer to a public that punished them for not being sufficiently restrictionist enough on migration. How is the Conservative Party in such disarray that its government commissioned and implemented the findings of the Cass Review, but its party apparatchiks expel members like me who have a career history of being consistently right on this issue years before the review was published? The Conservative Party seems intent on following Tony Blair's revolutionary on-rails way of doing politics until it careens off a cliff. They've reached Soviet levels of incapacity for self-reflection. They insist on abusive relationship with their base, breaking manifesto pledges, making unforced errors while campaigning, and engaging in blatant corruption while commanding ceaseless loyalty from disappointed supporters. If you point at the naked emperor, you are punished as if you stole his garments. I am unbothered by who chooses to drink from the poison chalice come the 2nd of November 2024, when the party will formally pick its leader. Recent convert to the blindingly obvious Robert Jenrick seems sincere, but forces in the Kemi corner seek to stop the faction, looking to recoup losses from reform, and instead insist on continuing the Cameron consensus. Those looking to make the party a viable electoral prospect would do well to ignore the one nation wets, blaming the loss on being insufficiently centrist. Reform UK has begun to understand that to bend the knee is to stoop to the height of the headsman's axe, but the Conservatives continue to run in circles like decapitated chickens, bereft of principles except doing all they can to avoid offending their opponents. So, where do the Conservative Party go next? Well, could be Robert Jenrick, but, as already mentioned, he has a lot of work to do to offload the baggage of the last 14 years of disastrous Conservative government. Newcomers like Katie Lamb are still too fresh-faced. Frankly, the party is like a business entering an insolvency period. So what usually happens when businesses do go bust? Well, another company comes in to acquire it. They appoint an emergency CEO who gets things in order. I think, and it's not beyond the realm of possibility, depending on how desperate they get, the Conservatives' only chance is to just appoint Rupert Lowe leader. I think the voter base will go along with it. I think he's the brightest mind in Parliament right now. He's apparently the most far right, according to Hope Not Hate, which is a ringing endorsement given the widespread popularity of his positions with the voting public. Whether or not the Conservatives will be wise enough to do that, we'll see. But whether it's Jenrick or Lowe, pretty much everyone, including in Kemi's former camp, are concluding that Badenoch's time is up. With that, thank you very much for watching. I'll be back next week at our regularly scheduled time. Until then, take care, God bless, and goodbye.